Hello, welcome to this Alteryx video. In this video, I'm going to go ahead and walk through the steps to build a puppy costume fact table because John Q has gotten with me and said that he needs to report puppy costumes back to the kennels and to the trainers and to the show organizers. I decided to take a slightly different direction in this tutorial. Rather than have a solution in mind and construct it and simply connect the widgets together and show you the ultimate solution, we're going to go start at the very beginning and look more at the development process, because building this fact table is a lot like the previous puppy fact table that we had built. So we're going to talk it through from the very beginning, doing this live, correcting some mistakes, testing it, and ultimately moving it so that we populate inside of my database. So where I start is typically with a data model. In this case, this is my data mart model that I have for the puppies. And we've seen this before with the puppy fact and the puppy performance summary fact. In this case, John Q needs a puppy costume fact table. He needs to be able to look at the data according to the breeds, the kennels, and the costumes, as well as summary level information for each puppy. So we'll need to bring in those dimensions. He wants to know how many different sizes of each costume the puppies have, as well as a textual representation of that overall list. And obviously, Alteryx is very easy or very capable of helping us do this. So to get started, we go into our empty workflow. We need to bring some data into it. So the very next thing that we need to do is go ahead and verify that we have all the data that we need. Obviously, we have a puppy table. We have a puppy dimension. I was very happy to see when I started this that I also had a puppy dimension, a costume dimension already created. I just want to make sure that it was indeed what I expected it to be, so I query that data. I can say I have my costume dimension. I have my puppy dimension. As well as we have the original puppy table itself, which has the raw data in it in case we want to go back and start there. So I've taken a quick look at the overall data that I need to work with. This makes sense. So we want to get started by dragging in the first piece of data that we need. So when I look at the data that's available, my original place to start was going to be with the puppy table. When I realized that I've already got most of this already post-processed, and since I have confidence in the ETL and the maintenance of the ETL, I don't mind creating a dependency on this workflow to something that's already in my data mart. So to start with, I'll drag my input data in, connect it to my MySQL database, and we're going to actually start with the puppy fact table because it already has a lot of the information associated with it. Type that all in accurately, get it here, set a couple of parameters in the configuration. Let's cache the data because this is development. Choose my none. Always like to watch it work because it's fun. Drop a select in there. Drop a browse in there. Take a look at this data, just run it through, get that cache built. Again, the window around that, or the crystal around it, shows that it's been cached. So here I have a major piece of the data that I need to worry about, which is the puppy's ID, the breed, the kennel. I don't need to be concerned about the birth weight or the batch timestamp. So I can go ahead into my select, right size this, By taking those two off of it, we are good to go. So let's bring in our costume data. Well, we have not yet instantiated that anywhere. This will be the first instantiation of that piece of information. So we need to go back to the source table that's been brought in as part of the development process, which is the puppy costume table. Connecting it up as well. It is the puppy costume table. Make sure I spelt that correctly. Again, set the 3 fields that I set during development. Stick a select and a browse onto this. Run through this data. Cache was run very quickly. Data runs quickly too. It's nice to be able to run locally. Take a look at the data coming out of this. We see we have the puppy's ID, the costume name, and the size, the information we need. We also need to go ahead and at this point in time just quickly change that puppy ID to be the warehouse ID, which is the same thing in this situation. I know this because of my metadata that I've maintained on it. So we have this information. Getting it together requires a join. Delete off my browses. Bring my join into this. We do not need the second copy of the puppy widget because we're going to go ahead and match those up. Automatically supplies the right side. I get the costume name and the size code and the other warehouse IDs that I need to populate out that fact table. Take a quick run of this. Look at the log. And every puppy does not have a costume. I have 520 that do not have costumes. I made a quick call to John Q, which we'll pretend that I'm doing right now. And I asked John Q, in your data mart in the fact table for puppy costumes, do you want an empty record that shows puppies that do not have costumes? It's a good question to ask because it affects the way that he does his processes and queries. He fortunately says no, only he needs to be reporting on puppies that have costumes. He doesn't want to worry about what to do with those that do not have costumes. So we're good to go with just the join. We don't worry about the left. And we see here that the right is okay. Everything's fine. So we want to proceed forward. Drop a select in here very quickly to see what it looks like. All looks good. We can continue through with it. And so now what we want to do is go ahead and match up the costume dimension into this workflow, and the stream will be using costume name, matching the costume name in that dimension. If you remember from previous exercises, we need to deal with the nulls and the unknowns coming in just to assure that this is good. This is the first time we've used this dimension. We need to know how clean that data is and to adjust our workflow to deal with any unusual data. Nice thing about development is you don't want to start things from scratch if you don't have to. I've already got a template for how I process this information, so we can go ahead and use that template rather than starting from the beginning. As I brought this template in and modified it, I realized that this is a perfect solution that's waiting for a macro to be created to process any dimension. So that's one of the next things I'm going to work on, is building that macro to be as fully open as possible, and then we'll talk about how that macro works and how I can then use it in my workflows, and we'll do a separate video for that macro. Macros are powerful, they're situational, and there's a little bit of rules that you have to learn while working with them. So the first thing I need to do now is to go and find my workflow that I want to cut some working pieces out of so I don't have to create everything from the beginning. That means obviously bringing up my file explorer. We did this with the puppy dimension in fact workflow. I'll double click on that so it'll bring it up in here. And what we want to look at is where we populated the breed dimension, the kennel dimension so that we were able to utilize the none for nulls and the -1 if there were some unknowns in there. We did that with these sets of widgets. So very quickly, all that I will do is I will highlight them, copy them, and then paste them into my main workflow and begin editing them to make them work. As I've done this in the past, this is when I realized that it'd be nice to have a macro to do it for me. But again, that's the subject of another day. So now back to our workflow. We'll go ahead and paste this in. And I just need to make some changes to it. Primarily, this kennel dimension now needs to be the costume dimension. So simply going into the definition, verify access. Not forgetting that we need to edit our custom comment. Cache the data. Check the other parameters, they look good. So we'll need to do some editing. You can argue whether creating this from scratch or editing is more meaningful, but we'll go ahead and just go ahead and edit it. Cleaning up as we go. We don't need again, just cleaning it up. Kennel wid, costume name, we'll leave that there just for the duration. We want side code and this wid. Not kennel wid, but costume wid. Give us some space so we can see as it goes through here. We go ahead and do the join. Let's go ahead and remove our missing fields. At this point in time, we would not need the costume name. We'd want to go ahead and move the costume name up, the costume wid up. Move the puppy wid up. We don't really need to be using this as a multi field. Let's go ahead and delete it. We'll put a formula in its place. Let's run this and see what it looks like. Retrospect, might have been easy to build it from scratch, but we're okay. Everything is done. Let's take a look at what comes out the other side. So we have the puppy wid, the breed wid, the costume wid, and the kennel wid, and the size codes. Put a browse on there, which is a better way of looking at the data profile. Everything's been cached, so this will run very quickly. And from the costume wid, look at the data profile. Min of 1. Max of 10. There were no nulls for the costume width, so nothing came out to be 0. So we went through extra work here just to assure that we didn't do anything untoward going forward. Anytime you find yourself believing in what the developers of the front-end systems tell you, it tends to cause a problem as you go forward in your data warehouse. So it's always a good idea to take care of any contentious issues that you have. So now this gives us the basic pieces of our costume fact table. It gives us the puppy, the breed, the costume, and the kennel. Remember, we need to count the number of sizes that each of the puppies have. And then we want to go ahead and concatenate a text string just so you can see what that looks like. We can do all of that. Oh, I forgot, we need to take care just in case we did have a null in here. We talked about that formula. Didn't exist. We'll go ahead and stick it in here anyway. So the column here is, again, what will happen is if it comes through the left, which has no data, we would not have the costume width. So that's what we want to go ahead and just take care of just in case that happens. So we will look at the costume width. We cut out this formula just so we can remember what it was. And we will simply replace into it the field names because we only have one we're dealing with. It's the costume width. It says that if the costume width is indeed null at this point in time, it means there's an unknown in there and we want to give it a -1. One last run, make sure nothing new got added into it. Let's fix our comment very quickly. And the data looks the same coming out. So now, like I said, our final step in this is going to go ahead and deal with our summarize. Remembering that we want all of these fields to come out, so we'll go ahead and group by all of those, even though these will not create any additional uniqueness. We just want to make sure they're in the final result. So we want to group by the puppy, group by the breed, group by the costume, group by the kennel. And again, this is just so we get them all into the output flow going into our data storage. And we want to do two things with side code. We want to count it. Looking at, we want to go quickly bring in our data model so we can make sure we remember what we wanted to call this. It was actually called the sizes count. And the last thing we want to do in this as well is one of my fun things, which is the concatenate. So we want to go down into string. We have concatenate. It gives us a lot of features. Again, we're going to call this sizes text. And we want to start it with a open bracket, separated with a comma and a space. Close it with a brace or a bracket. Now let's run this. Coming out the other end, we see that most of our puppies only have one size of a costume, but where we have multiple sizes of costumes, we have the actual sizes. You notice that this is sorted alphabetically, not in actual size, but that's okay for this scenario, because when we break this out for any reason, we'll be able to break it out and then sort it as we break it out. But this gives us what John Q wanted to see. Last thing we want to do is go ahead and put that into a table. I'm going to leave the browse there because I like to leave browses in my workflows when I'm running them and looking at them. Output data. it's Daisy Hill's puppy costume fact. Create new table. This is the first time we run it. Quoted of none. Let's change our comment while we think about it. The last thing we want to do is when we create this, remember we want to create a primary key as well to make this more efficient. Do that in the post create SQL statement. Create alter table, table name, add primary key, and it'll be on puppy ID and costume ID. Again, this is not validated when we create it. It'll simply be validated at execution. So we can rerun this and recreate the table if we need to. We also will change this to overwrite table. If the drop fails, it will not give us an error. We can now run this. And we'll wait for the data to be created in this MySQL database. So it's done. It's given us an error because my primary key was wrong. Again, this is a live work session. So I also noticed we had one other minor issue with this. As I looked at my table definition, it wasn't puppy ID, it was puppy wid. As you can see here, here's my puppy costume. Puppy wid also knows that the size count was a big integer. Just want to make that a regular integer. So we got some fixes to make in our process because we validated against the database. Plus this little error here let us know. So let's go ahead and drop a select in here. Yeah, there's our integer 64, which just really needs to be an integer. And we'll go ahead and look at our alter table statement because that was erroneous. Stream of consciousness, just left the W out. Reconnect this guy. So once having done that, we can now go through this process and rerun this, knowing that it will drop the table and recreate it with new attributes. So it has been completed. Verifying the way it looks means I'll bring in my SQL workbench. Very quickly go ahead and refresh this. Drop down to my costume fact table. And you can see we have a primary key as well as our columns. Query it very quickly. Data looks like we expected, so we're good to go. We want to make one final change in all this, which will allow me to continue the development work or to run this on a periodic basis as our data changes. And that is that as we go into maintenance, we don't want to drop the table and recreate it each time. We simply want to overwrite the data. So we'll make a copy of this widget. Rather than overwrite table, we'll go ahead and delete data and append. We will not want to alter our table. So this will stand as it is. But since we don't want to run the two of these, this is my tool container trick. This will be create table. Drop this guy into it. We'll disable it. That way it won't run until I need it to. And we'll do the same thing with this one, which is to create a tool container. Call this append. data. Drag this one into it. We'll leave that one unchecked for right now, so it'll be enabled. So now we can run this, go through the process, and now it will append our data. This appears to work the way we need it to, and so we can now tell John Q he has a new table to play with.